There's a quiet truth about retirement that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not just about how much you save, it's about what you choose to do with what you've saved. Over the years, I've spent a great deal of time observing retirees, some who move into this phase of life with confidence and clarity, and others who find themselves constantly worrying, adjusting, and frankly, struggling more than they expected. And what stands out isn't always income level. It isn't even always discipline. More often than people realize, it comes down to decisions, specifically the kinds of assets they choose to hold on to in retirement. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You can do a lot of things right and still undermine your retirement if your money is tied up in the wrong places. That's what I want to walk you through today, gently, honestly, and without judgment. Let's start with one of the most deceptively appealing traps, the illusion of the guaranteed vacation, timeshares. At first glance, timeshares feel almost comforting. There's a promise embedded in them, consistency, tradition, a sense that you're investing in future memories, a place your family can return to year after year. And emotionally, that's powerful. But financially, it's often a very different story. Because a timeshare doesn't behave like an investment, it behaves like an obligation. Once you're in, you're in. There are annual maintenance fees, special assessments, exchange costs if you want flexibility. And those costs don't pause just because your circumstances change. What's more, when people try to exit, they're often surprised by how little demand exists on the resale market. I've seen retirees hold on to timeshares not because they still love them, but because they feel stuck. Now compare that to how more financially secure retirees tend to think. They still travel, they still value experiences deeply, but they choose flexibility. They rent where they want, when they want. They adapt their travel to their health, their interests, even their energy levels. And perhaps most importantly, they keep their money working for them, rather than locked into a structure that demands something from them every single year. When guaranteed income comes at a cost, high-fee annuities. There's something undeniably reassuring about the phrase guaranteed income, especially in retirement. It speaks to stability, predictability, peace of mind. And that's exactly why high-fee annuities are so compelling on the surface. But what often gets overlooked is what sits underneath that promise. These products can be layered with fees, some visible, many not. There are commissions, rider costs, administrative expenses, and over time, those layers quietly erode returns. Then there's the issue of flexibility. Many of these contracts come with surrender charges, which means if your needs change, and they often do in retirement, you may not be able to access your own money without penalty. I remember a case that stayed with me. A woman had placed a large portion of her savings into a variable annuity. She already had sufficient income from other sources. Her essential needs were covered. What she actually wanted was flexibility and the ability to leave something meaningful behind for her family. But the product she'd been sold didn't align with that goal at all. And by the time she realized it, she was locked in. This is where a quieter, more thoughtful approach often serves people better. Instead of seeking guarantees wrapped in complexity, many successful retirees lean towards simple, low-cost, flexible income strategies. Because in retirement, control matters just as much as income. The emotional pull of whole life insurance. Insurance, at its core, is about protection. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when insurance begins to blur into investment territory, particularly later in life, it can become less effective. Whole life policies are often presented as a kind of dual-purpose solution, protection plus growth. But growth takes time. And for retirees, or those nearing retirement, that time horizon is often much shorter than these products require to become efficient. What ends up happening is this. People commit to long-term premium payments for a benefit that may never fully materialize in a meaningful way for them. Meanwhile, that same money could have remained liquid, accessible, and adaptable. There's a clarity I've noticed among more confident retirees. They separate their strategies. Insurance is for protection. Investments are for growth and income. And when each piece is allowed to do its job without overlap or confusion, the overall plan becomes much stronger. Rental properties, income or invisible work. Real estate has long been associated with wealth building, and in many cases, rightly so. But retirement changes the equation. What once felt like a manageable investment can begin to feel like a responsibility. Tenants, repairs, vacancies, unexpected expenses, and perhaps most importantly, time. Because even if the numbers appear attractive on paper, the lived experience of managing property can be very different. I often encourage retirees to ask a simple question. If I had this money in a different form, could it serve me better? In one situation, a retiree held significant equity in a property that was generating modest income. When we reframed the numbers, it became clear that reallocating that equity into a diversified portfolio could potentially produce comparable or even greater income without the ongoing demands. And that's really the distinction. It's not that real estate is inherently bad. It's that in retirement, efficiency and ease begin to matter more than ownership itself. The temptation of high-yield bonds. Income is a central concern in retirement, so when something offers a higher yield, it naturally draws attention. High-yield bonds, sometimes referred to as junk bonds, often fall into this category. They promise more income, but that income comes with a trade-off, higher risk. And here's the part that's easy to miss. That risk tends to show up at exactly the wrong time, during economic downturns, when stability matters most, when retirees are relying on that income. Instead of reaching for yield, more experienced investors tend to step back and think in terms of roles. Stocks for growth, high-quality bonds for stability and liquidity, each piece doing what it's designed to do. Because when one asset is forced to behave like another, the entire system becomes less reliable. Complexity disguised as innovation, structured products. There's a certain appeal to financial products that sound sophisticated. Market upside, downside protection, engineered outcomes. But complexity can sometimes be a signal, not of innovation, but of misalignment. If you can't clearly explain how an investment works, it becomes very difficult to understand how it might fail. And every investment has a failure point. Structured products often include layers of conditions, caps, participation rates, and embedded costs that aren't immediately visible. And while they may perform well under certain scenarios, they can also limit upside or introduce risks that are hard to anticipate. In contrast, many successful retirees lean into simplicity, not because it's basic, but because it's transparent. And in retirement, clarity is a form of protection. The dream of a vacation home. There's something deeply emotional about the idea of a second home, a place to gather, to retreat, to create lasting memories. And for some, it works beautifully. But for many others, it becomes something else entirely. An underused asset with ongoing costs, taxes, maintenance, insurance, utilities, and often a subtle pressure to make use of it, even when travel preferences or energy levels change. What I've seen among more financially resilient retirees is a shift in mindset. They still value those experiences, but they choose flexibility over ownership. They rent exceptional places, explore new destinations, adjust as life evolves. And in doing so, they preserve both their financial resources and their freedom. The quiet cost of actively managed funds. This is one of the more subtle areas where wealth can slowly erode. Actively managed funds often come with a narrative, expert management, strategic decisions, the potential to outperform. But over time, the data has shown something consistent. After fees, many of these funds underperform their benchmarks. And those fees, management costs, trading expenses, tax inefficiencies, compound quietly, year after year. What wealthier retirees tend to prioritize instead is cost control. Low-cost index funds, broad diversification, tax efficiency, because even small differences in fees, when compounded over time, can have a significant impact on outcomes. And in retirement, preserving what you've built becomes just as important as growing it. So what do successful retirees do differently? If there's one theme that runs through all of this, it's intentional simplicity. They don't chase complexity. They don't pursue every opportunity that promises more. Instead, they ask better questions. Is this flexible? Is this transparent? Does this align with what I actually need, not just today, but 5 or 10 years from now? They focus on total return, not just income. They remain aware of taxes, not obsessively, but thoughtfully. They keep liquidity available, and perhaps most importantly, they stay curious. They revisit their plans, they adjust, they remain engaged. Because retirement isn't a static phase of life, it's a living, evolving experience. And if there's one takeaway I'd leave you with, it's this. Financial success in retirement isn't about avoiding every mistake. It's about avoiding the ones that quietly limit your freedom, the ones that lock you in, the ones that make your life more complicated than it needs to be. Because at the end of the day, retirement isn't just about money. It's about how you live. And the best financial decisions, the ones that truly matter, are the ones that support that life rather than restrict it. The hidden thread, it's not about avoiding, it's about aligning. When people hear a list like this, assets to avoid, it can feel restrictive, almost like a set of rules. But that's not really the point. The deeper lesson here isn't about avoiding specific products or categories altogether. It's about understanding why certain choices tend to work against you in retirement. Because when you understand that, your decisions start to shift naturally. You stop asking, is this a good investment? And you start asking, does this fit the life I'm trying to build? That's a much more powerful question. Liquidity, the freedom most people underestimate. One of the most consistent patterns I've seen among financially confident retirees is this. They value access. Not just income, not just growth, but access to their money when they need it. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly important because retirement isn't predictable. Your health can change, your priorities can evolve, opportunities, both joyful and challenging, can arise unexpectedly. And when too much of your wealth is tied up in illiquid assets, timeshares, certain annuities, complex insurance policies, real estate that can't easily be sold, you lose something essential: flexibility. I've seen retirees who were technically wealthy on paper, but felt constrained in their daily lives because accessing their own money was difficult, costly, or slow. And I've seen others with less overall wealth who felt far more at ease because their resources were accessible, adaptable, and aligned with their needs. That difference matters more than people expect. The role of simplicity in reducing stress. There's another dimension to all of this that doesn't always show up in financial statements, and that's stress. Complex portfolios filled with layered products, multiple contracts, and unclear structures don't just create financial inefficiency, they create mental weight. You start to wonder, am I missing something? Is this performing the way it should? What happens if I need to make a change? And over time, that uncertainty can become exhausting. In contrast, there's a quiet confidence that comes from simplicity. When you understand what you own, when you know why you own it, and when you can explain it clearly to someone else, that clarity reduces stress in a very real way. It allows you to spend less time worrying about your finances and more time actually living your life. Opportunity cost, the question that changes everything. This is one of the most powerful concepts in retirement planning, and yet it's often overlooked. Every financial decision carries an opportunity cost. When you put money into one place, you're choosing not to put it somewhere else. And that trade-off becomes especially important in retirement, where your resources are no longer being replenished through earned income in the same way. So instead of simply asking, "Does this generate income?" it can be helpful to ask, "What else could this money be doing for me?" That question has a way of cutting through emotional attachments and surface-level appeal. It brings you back to fundamentals. For example, a vacation home might bring joy, but could that same capital provide more flexibility, more travel options, and less ongoing cost if used differently? A high-fee product might promise guarantees, but what's the trade-off in terms of growth, liquidity, or control? This isn't about eliminating enjoyment. It's about ensuring that your financial choices are working as efficiently as possible in support of that enjoyment. The importance of tax awareness without obsession. Taxes are one of those areas where balance is key. Ignore them entirely, and you may end up giving away more than necessary. Focus on them too much, and you risk making decisions that are overly restrictive or short-sighted. What I've observed among successful retirees is a kind of quiet awareness. They don't chase tax strategies for the sake of it, but they do structure their portfolios in a way that's mindful of when income is realized, how gains are taxed, where different assets are held. They understand that tax efficiency isn't about perfection. It's about keeping more of what you've already earned without complicating your life in the process. Working with the right guidance, or knowing when not to. This is an area that deserves a bit of honesty. Not all advice is created equal, and not all incentives are aligned. Some financial professionals are compensated in ways that naturally steer them towards certain products, annuities, insurance policies, actively managed funds. That doesn't automatically make those products wrong, but it does mean you have to be thoughtful, because the recommendation you receive may not always be driven solely by what's best for you. I've spoken with individuals who later realized that a significant portion of their portfolio had been placed into products that generated high commissions, but didn't necessarily align with their goals, and that can be frustrating. What tends to work better is finding guidance that is transparent, aligned with your outcomes, focused on strategy, not just products, or, in some cases, building enough understanding yourself to ask better questions. Because even if you work with an advisor, your awareness is still your first line of defense. The shift from accumulation to stewardship. Before retirement, much of the focus is on accumulation, saving, growing, building. But retirement introduces a different mindset. It becomes less about building more and more about stewarding what you already have. That shift changes everything. You begin to think in terms of sustainability, efficiency, risk management, lifestyle alignment. And in that context, many of the asset traps we've discussed start to make more sense, because they often belong to a different phase of life or a different set of priorities, and holding on to them without reevaluating their role can create friction. A more grounded framework for decision-making. If you were to simplify all of this into a practical framework, something you could return to whenever you're making a financial decision, it might look like this. 1. Can I understand it clearly? If not, it may not belong in your portfolio. 2. Is it flexible? Can you adapt, exit, or adjust if your situation changes? 3. What are the total costs, visible and hidden? Not just up front, but over time. 4. What role does it play? Growth, income, stability. Each asset should have a clear purpose. 5. What's the opportunity cost? Could this money serve you better elsewhere? These questions aren't complicated, but they're powerful, and over time they tend to guide people toward better, more aligned decisions. Bringing it back to what matters most. At the heart of all of this is something very simple. Retirement is not a financial event, it's a life transition. And the role of your financial decisions is not just to preserve wealth. It's to support the kind of life you actually want to live. That might include time with family, travel and exploration, peace of mind, the ability to respond to life's changes without financial strain. And when your financial structure supports those things, rather than complicating them, you feel it. There's a lightness, a sense of control, a quiet confidence that you're not just managing your money, you're using it well. A final thought. If there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this, it's this. You don't need to chase complexity to achieve a successful retirement. In fact, more often than not, it's the opposite. The retirees who navigate this phase most successfully tend to keep things simple, stay flexible, remain thoughtful about costs, and align their decisions with their real lives, not just financial theory. Because in the end, wealth isn't just about numbers. It's about freedom, clarity, and the ability to live on your own terms.